You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're going over some of our favorite 2024 horror movies. Horror thrillers, horror slashers, old school, new school. We're talking In a Violent Nature, Totally Killer, Maxine, Late Night with the Devil, and more. Here we go. All right, you guys ready? Have your list ready to go?
I'm going to start from scratch. You recording?
I am recording. You'll have to go into the deleted folder to find that list, Pete, because people are listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast.
Command Z. Command
Z. I'm Bernie Gonzalez, one of your hosts, and you just heard from Command Z himself, Pete Charbonneau, and we have Fan2Fan All-Star # stranger friend Allan back into his house. Allan, thanks for coming back, man.
Thank you guys for having me. You know I love being here. So ready to talk horror. Let's do it.
Perfect. Well, we got the perfect thing to talk about, Allan. We're going to talk about horror films. 'Tis the season.
Oh, boy, there should be some wildlife around here.
Surprise!
The McDonald's Happy Meal guys.
Yep, let's get your McNuggets. Regular soft drink and regular fries.
And they are lying.
What do you put in your McDonald's Halloween pumpkins?
Booty McBoo, matey. Carrots in a goblin. Golden McPumpkin, partner.
Now you can collect one of 3 different pumpkins with the purchase of every McDonald's Halloween Pumpkin Happy Meal. What you put in them is up to you.
Essentially, we're really just going to talk about movies, horror movies that we discovered, we watched in 2024, because there was a lot of horror, whether they're streaming, whether the box office is up or down, or always seems to be up. The stock always seems to be going up, whether it's indie horror or studios that are discovering or rediscovering that there's an audience for horror. Seems like a perfect time to talk about some movies that we've stumbled onto this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's always interesting because you think about the psychology of horror and how often horror movies kind of reflect the time that we're living in. I'm curious to see where a lot of this stuff that's coming out now lands. I mean, obviously it's, it remains kind of a weird time in general in the world. And I think a lot of us are kind of sifting through many different things mentally, physically, figuring our place in the world and what it all means. And so I think that's reflected somewhat in some of the movies that have come out this year. But, Bernie, as you said, we're not just going to confine it to 2024 horror movies, although that may end up taking up a bulk of what we talk about. It's the bulk of my list, but there's always the stuff that we discover along the way or rediscover haven't watched in a while. So I'm anxious and excited to talk some horror with both of you fine gentlemen.
I feel like, to Pete's point, there's a dark edge in filmmaking. It's a little bit more grainy. It's a little bit more realistic. It almost feels, and I think I've said this to you guys before, it feels like the movies coming out in 2024 and 2025 are trying to almost throw back to a time of like the 70s and the early 80s when we made stories that were so real they were frightening.
One of the movies that you had brought up on your Halloween favorites list, Allan, was Rosemary's Baby. Paramount Plus. They're now doing a prequel to Rosemary's Baby, and it's like Apartment 7A or something.
When we found you, you were nothing. We have given you everything. This is a role that you were born to play.
There's definitely a 70s vibe to a lot of the stuff coming out now. Some of it may be creeping in a little bit to the 80s, but I think back to when, and we've talked about this many times on the podcast, but, I grew up a child of the 80s and kind of came of age discovering those slasher movies of the 80s, which were mostly low budget fare. It wasn't so much the story. It was just kind of whether it was capitalizing on the hype of Halloween or something like that. They were just churning them out because they were cheap to make and they made money.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Friday the 13th. You may only see it once, but that will be enough. Friday the 13th, rated R.
I feel like the stuff that's coming out now, it's got like a bit of a darker bent, but we've got some I don't know if you want to call them auteurs making these films, but horror seems to have graduated to a different category than what it was in the 80s and even the 90s. And I think that you've got some like really talented filmmakers that are churning out some stuff now, and it's just a lot different. You know, even something, and I will probably talk about this a little bit later, but something like In a Violent Nature, you know, plays very much on the tropes of those 80s slashers. It's saying something different. It's a different perspective, clearly, but it's also just shot in a different way. It seems elevated from that stuff that we all grew up on in the 80s. So an interesting time for horror. And again, like I'm excited to kind of go through our lists here and dive into a bit more with some of the movies that you all saw and recommend.
Before we jump into the list, I'm kind of interested, Allan. So you and Rebecca, you hit the theaters, you have streaming services, so you've got all of this available, right? Where does horror rate for you guys? Like if there's a good action flick, a good comedy, a good sci-fi flick, do you find yourselves gravitating to horror movies or TV shows? Is it mostly a seasonal thing where come October, and you've talked about this before, you guys kind of have your schedule, your calendar, we're going to count our way down to, you know, those great horror movies as we're getting close to the 31st in October. So where's like horror play out for you guys?
The aspect of us watching a lot of horror, like a lot of like original horror is all October. I mean, we start October. We actually started a little early this year because we were kind of craving it. But our order going to the movies is always going to be, what's the best movie currently playing? What's the best reviewed movie? What looks the most interesting? And right now it's mystery thrillers are huge. We'll sort of gravitate towards Silence of the Lambs type movies. You know, anything that's a bit of like a thriller, like mind-fucky, adventure. We're in. If we were put on the spot, I'd say we probably would do like action adventure first, and then we would get into our mystery thriller. Then we would get into horror.
How about you, Pete? You know, it's 8:30, 9 p.m. You're kind of winding down from work, from everything you've got going on. You throw on Tubi or Pluto. Maybe there's a good Doug McClure, Peter Cushing movie. Always hard to resist one of those.
Don't threaten me with a good time, Bernie.
Do you think you find yourself clicking maybe more on a horror movie in that kind of situation where, you know, you're willing to give maybe a forgotten 80s slasher that, you know, didn't make the cut when, you know, you were going to the drive-in? You're like, all right, well, I'll maybe check out The Burning or The Mauler now because it's free, but for a few ads. Where does horror fit for you then?
Yeah, it's a good question. I go back and forth. Like I will have nights where I'm just kind of hitting forward on the streaming services and just kind of going through the list of stuff, just waiting for something to kind of grab me. We talked about a while back on the podcast how we kind of discovered when we were going through our 80s 3D extravaganza, Silent Madness, which was something that was completely off our radar, and how you and I both really enjoyed it for, you know, kind of what it evoked from those movies, but also still kind of elevated a little bit above and beyond like a lot of that standard fare. So I guess a lot of times I'm kind of searching for that next Silent Madness movie. Is there anything out there that I may have missed along the way?
These conditions are inhuman.
These patients are inhuman. We get all the weird ones, the real crazies.
How can you and Dr. Kruger keep releasing patients as disabled as Romano?
I believe I know more about these matters than you do, Dr. Gilmore.
Oh my God. They released the wrong man.
Silent Madness. A terrifying, suspense-filled voyage into the dark places of the mind. Inside your head, the screaming never stops. Silent Madness. Rated R.
And barring that, if I'm not seeing it, sometimes I'll give Shudder to admit this, but I threw on some movie Death Spa the other day, which was just absolutely horrendous in all phases, from acting to whatever. But sometimes you click on a thumbnail and you see it was made in 86, 87, 88, and you're like, oh, I missed one from the 80s. Let me go back and watch it. And sometimes you quickly discover there's a reason why you missed it in the 80s and probably should have kept it in the 80s. And that's one of them.
That was probably not on Allan's staff recommends when he was at Mike's Movies.
I don't think so, but it might have been on my recommends when I was 12 years old, 2:00 in the morning, trying to see some titties.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you do get that. There's some definitely unintentional comedy in that one. Like this one woman goes blind. She gets out of the hospital, has like the 2 giant gauze bandages over her eyes, and her boyfriend is like feeding her asparagus in this like what's supposed to be a romantic dinner. At the same time, phallic, but also like the asparagus is like kind of soggy, and so it's like it's kind of gross and not really sexy or appealing.
Death Swab. Welcome to the health club where you'll sweat blood.
Never work without a spotter, Freddie. Weight falls on your chest and you can really get squashed.
It's the place for a killer workout. An unquiet spirit reaches out from beyond the grave.
Welcome to my party.
For revenge.
I will destroy this place. And I'll kill them all. Unless you do as I say.
Death Swab. An exercise in terror.
A fantastic weight reduction program. People get so thin they disappear.
There's been a lot of stuff. I'm going to throw out some titles out here. I'll be interested to see if they end up on some of your lists. And I think the great thing about this conversation is it could be a new movie that came out in 2024 or TV show for that matter. It could just be a movie that you guys watch for the first time, because there's a few that I have on my list that certainly would be in like those 80 slashers genre that you were talking about, Pete, that got past me back then because I was too busy rewatching Friday the 13th for the umpteenth time. And a few of these just got right past me. But 2024, not for a lack of options for horror and horror adjacent. Because when I see movies like Alien Romulus, Quiet Place Day One, those certainly have a lot of horror elements, some more obviously sci-fi, but all you have to do is watch the trailers for those and you see that they're playing on close quarters, isolation, fear, a lot of what the original Alien played on. And then there are more straightforward horror flicks like The Strangers, Chapter 1, In a Violent Nature that you mentioned, Pete, Abigail. In some ways, maybe a little bit of a spoiler here, it's kind of Dracula's daughter with a bit of a twist. You get, it's almost like its own adjective now, A24 style horror, where if you want to call it elevated, movies like The Substance. And it seems like there's a lot more going on there beyond just straight up horror. There's some psychological stuff there, maybe some questions about aging. We got to see Late Night with the Devil earlier this year, Pete, in the theater. And that was a trip because it played off on a lot of the late night host tropes that we grew up with, spun them in this blender of horror and found footage. Earlier this year, I think when a lot of those copyright lapses have started to happen that a lot of folks are all over social media about. We saw Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, Part 2. You had Mad God, Stop Motion. I Saw the TV Glow, Long Legs, Oddity, Cuckoo. Tons of movies out there. These are horror movies, and there's probably a ton more. Shudder, Screenbox, filled with even more indie horror that's out there. Pete, I'll start with you. Let's kind of get the conversation going. Is there one movie that you saw that you want to start off with? Horror 2024.
I mean, you definitely mentioned a couple. I went back to see. I was surprised. When I first started going through compiling a list, I'm like, did I really see like that much new horror? And I did. I think I did a decent job, all things considered. You know, like Allan, like I will go if something's playing in the theater, I'll go see it if and when I can, just because I prefer the experience to watching it at home. So I did get to see a bunch. Like you mentioned, we got to see Late Night with the Devil. I just recently saw The Substance, so would love to talk about that without giving away too much on the spoilers. But the first one I think I'll bring up, probably not straight horror, but again, like Allan, you were saying, horror adjacent, and that's Strange Darling.
This is a dramatization of the true story of the final known killings of the most prolific and unique American serial killer of the 21st century.
You know,
know you asked for this, right?
Just trying to have a good time.
I'm in control.
Don't say it out loud.
Gotcha.
I want something intimate, something romantic.
Really was impressed with the storytelling, the structure of it. It's kind of heavily reliant upon you going in knowing as little as possible, because it does kind of get very in your face with very recognizable stereotypes and tropes of like thriller, horror, and then proceeds to, kind of turn them on their head. So I don't want to give away too much there, because I highly recommend, people go and seek that out for themselves. But, shot on 35 millimeter. Cinematographer was Giovanni Ribisi, who is a name that might resonate with a lot of people, character actor. Just absolutely looks beautiful, great use of color, like deep reds and blues. The lead performances, Kyle Gallner, plays the demon. And again, like the titles are trying to evoke something out of you, and maybe that's what it seems, and maybe it's not. Really impressed with Willa Fitzgerald, who is the leading female actress in this. She is kind of coming at it from all angles of emotion, and she's playing kind of damsel in distress a little bit. She's got power, she's got sexuality, she's got she runs the gamut of emotions and what she brings to this role, and it's a very powerful performance. Like there's some scenes in this that are intensely erotic, but then at the same time, it just like it turns and becomes extremely violent. It becomes extremely tense. But, I can't praise it enough. It's probably one of my favorite films that I saw in 2024, just because I didn't know much about it. And that was on purpose, because again, like they were trying not to spoil too much with this one. Just from the little that I read, I was kind of hooked and intrigued. And so I got to see it locally here in North Carolina. It was playing, and it was me and I think 3 other people in the theater. And we all enjoyed it. We had a little confab after the fact. Yeah, that's my lead off for 2024.
It's a movie too that seems like on social media, Kyle Gallner has been really trying to like drum up support for the film, for people to see it. I think even offering theaters to kind of have like a showing to kind of keep the momentum going, because this was like a word of mouth movie. I think that's fair to say. It wasn't like there was a legitimate, like big time marketing push for this where you saw billboards. This was people online telling other people, like-minded people, check this out. It's interesting. There's some interesting twists, great performances. So I even saw people like J.J. Abrams touting praise for the movie to try to hopefully just keep getting more than those 3 people into theater.
Yeah, and I love it. It's played in a series, I think, of 5 or 6 chapters plus an epilogue. But like I said, it's out of sequence. So you start off, you're kind of thrown in the middle, and then it kind of jumps back and forth, and it fills in information. And so again, something that you see at the start, oh, okay, I get this character, this type of characterization. Then that gets flipped, but it still comes back. The script is tight enough, and the filmmaking is good enough so that scenes that you're seeing early on take on a whole new meaning when they're run again later, or they're expanded later, or you notice like something that a character does where you're like, oh, this guy is just, he's kind of just an addict and doing all these drugs. No, you find out later there's a reason for some of that. And so I love that all the actions and all the things that are introduced in this film kind of have a point to them. It's like it's not red herrings. The story, everything that's presented in the story serves a purpose. And I really liked it about it. It's very tight. Ed Begley Jr. Shows up.
Always a winner.
When you got some Begley chewing some scenery for a little bit, at the very least, that's a positive. I was going to say you're having a good time. It is a thriller, if not necessarily out and out horror, but ostensibly it's about a serial killer. So that's where, again, like horror adjacent, but there's enough stuff going on there that I think you would fit it into, at least I am, because, as one of the co-hosts of the podcast, I have carte blanche to set the rules as I see fit. And I'd be remiss if I don't mention that Begley's wife in the film is played by Barbara Hershey. Again, another great actress that we've seen way too little of in these later years. And we can maybe get into that a little bit. You were talking about The Substance, which I just saw. That movie is fucked up. But, I highly recommend see that. But you want to talk about, dealing with aging, especially aging among women. I think that ties in a little bit. Like, I can't remember the last thing that I saw Barbara Hershey in. So it was just, again, pleasant surprise that she popped up in this.
There you go. Allan, throw out your first one out there.
So the first one I'm going to talk about is one of the more sort of interesting remakes I've seen in a while. Salem's Lot, 2024.
I've always written stories about things that are so terrible. You'll run away until your brain won't remember.
So why did you come back?
I'm here for research.
What exactly, though, are you researching?
I can see her lying back in her satin dress.
Have you noticed anything out of the ordinary in the lot recently?
Don't confess. Sundown, you're
There are some folks who had some kind of unusual experiences.
Sundown, you better take care. If I find you've been creeping down my back stairs.
The movie itself is it's shot in a way that the best way to describe it is it's almost done intentionally, like an 80s miniseries that you would have seen on like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. It felt so much like it or The Stand. So,
or dare we say the original Salem's Lot?
Even better, yes. I can't believe the respect that was paid to that like TV movie style. Like this movie clearly had a bunch of money behind it, but it was stylized to look like it came out 30 years ago. As far as the movie went, I enjoyed it. I thought it had some genuine stakes to it, and not talking about the stakes that they were using so cleverly, using household items, broken broomsticks, the bottoms of tables to kill these vampires. I mean, just a fun remake. Really good at doing the horror thing where like it's an intense night scene and we're going to scare the shit out of you. And then boom, it's day and we get a break and we get to breathe and we get to collect ourselves. And with the heroes, we get to decide what we're going to do next. How are we going to deal with this town full of vampires? It was like a Stephen King version of 30 Days of Night in that way that like the whole town was being taken over by vampires, although 30 Days of Night is far more violent. But I recommend it for anybody who's a King fan. The Nosferatu character there, Barlow. Me and Rebecca were trying to decide if that was Peter from What We Do in the Shadows. If that was him before he ended up in the basement at What We Do in the Shadows. Great movie. It just an old-fashioned vampire horror movie, and it was a lot of fun.
As a big fan of the novel, probably the first Stephen King book that I read, something like that. I don't remember how many pages it is, but I think one of the big criticisms has always been like, how do you adapt something similar to a lot of his works? How do you adapt something like that into one movie? And I think at some point this had maybe been planned to be a 2-parter, maybe even a 3-parter.
Probably should have been.
Yeah. So that was going to be my question is, how good of a job do you think they did in kind of condensing that story down into one feature-length film?
So I think it was probably the biggest failing of the movie. I mean, in the movie, the vampires were good. The scares were pretty solid. The way that they were learning from books, the way we would from the internet now, it's like it was great to see them go to books and magazines to get the information on how to kill a vampire rather than Google it. But as far as paying tribute to the book, there's no way. I mean, they They ran out of time, they ran out of space, and then they sort of, the final kill is great, right? Of Barlow, but it's anticlimactic a little bit, the build up to it. How much longer is left of this movie? It's going to be another hour and a half, right? And it's 20 minutes, and you're like, oh, okay, so they're going to rush to this. And they did, which is probably the biggest failure in the movie.
Bernie, I was going to ask you, what did not hold up for you in watching?
I agree 100% with Allan. Do you ever listen to a podcast at like 1.25 speed? Not in full like chipmunk mode where they're talking high pitched. That's how the movie felt for something that you can't help but judge against the Tobe Hooper TV series. That needed space to breathe, and it got it. There was like this exploration of a small town, all the quirky characters, and then suddenly vampires have arrived.
Yeah.
How does that impact the community, the small town of people, what their lives are like? That's the one thing that was missing with this, because it went through the paces so quickly. It needed breathing room. And I don't know if it would have been enough to give it another 30 minutes. I think it would have probably needed to be the 3-part miniseries where you could squeeze in the characterization that was missing, because they did a lot of good things. Like, it's just not the sum of its parts. And some of the stuff that, Allan, that you were talking about, like the scene with the drive-in, the idea with the car trunks. I'm like, this is really cool. Like, this is interesting, not only visually, but it's unique. And having not read the book, maybe someone who read Salem's Lot's like, that's all in the book. Great. Then they actually took some stuff that I didn't see in the 70s miniseries. So this is cool. And they certainly did not skimp on the budget. It was a good looking movie. The vampires were menacing. It felt like it was in the same universe as the 2016 or 17 It movies, the chapter 1 and 2, where this could have been in that same world, because the aesthetic, the look of it felt right. They made these little adjustments that I think watching a horror movie, particularly a vampire movie in the modern day, and especially even if you have a movie that takes place in a certain period or a certain era, you can kind of get past the idea of not having cell phones or having Wikipedia to look up how to kill vampires. They were able to like circumvent those things in a way that made sense, with a little tongue in cheek, where you get the kid that picks up Famous Monsters of Filmland or Fangoria. Got it. This is all great. I love this. That's what I loved in the original. That's why I love things like Fright Night. This makes sense. But why are you moving so fast, where it seems like you've got some interesting characters, but you won't let us get to know them? I think that's what was interesting about the miniseries and why I liked it so much, because you got to know all these people, and then you got to see how this menace impacted all of them. That's the biggest thing that was missing with this. I don't know if I'm as critical as I've seen other people be about it. It's like you have to kind of judge it on its own merits. And I think maybe that's the other weight it has to carry. We all know vampire lore. And I think, it's not too different from zombie movies, and how shows like Walking Dead or even like modern day zombie films still have to kind of work around the fact that we all in the audience know you shoot them in the brain and then they're dead. Well, do the people in the movie know that? Did they also watch Night of the Living Dead? So they know, is it the same lore? So there's a little bit of that this movie works around. It's like, do you stake them? How do you know that? Did you watch Nosferatu? Like, did you grow up with Hammer horror? How do you know this? So it does some interesting things to try to make that work. It doesn't always work.
John texted me after too, and he was like, don't waste your time. I'm like, well, I mean, I've got to see it. I get my expectations were tempered when this has been in, if not development hell, it's been in release hell for a couple of years now. Like, it was supposed to originally be a theatrical release, and we're not going to release it theatrically, and people have been kind of waiting, and it's almost like it kind of got dumped out there. So I'm ecstatic, Allan, that you enjoyed it. I feel like I can kind of judge it on its merits for what it is. I'm not expecting, nor am I going to try to compare it to the miniseries, which I have a deep fondness for, having seen that when I was young.
If you thought you could never be frightened by a television movie, watch what happens to the citizens of Salem's Lot. Is something evil killing the people in Salem's Lot, or are they killing each other?
Run! No!
A terrifying 3-hour special movie presentation Tuesday. Watch it with someone you trust.
And I'm curious too, like, it's hard to imagine thinking back to that miniseries and that first half. there's not a lot that goes on because it's like you said, Bernie, it's all character building and it's introducing all these characters in the town. And there's definitely some menace and there's some dread that's building, but like the vampire action stuff doesn't really kick in until the second half. And I don't know how much modern audiences would like sit still for something like that. So it's like, it's an interesting choice by the filmmakers to be like, well, we can't really do that slow burn build up. We kind of got to get into it a little bit quicker. And we also don't have the luxury of 3 hours or even 2.5 hours to tell this story. So everything kind of gets ramped up. Like you said, it's like 1.5 speed. So, I mean, I can appreciate those choices that were made. I kind of have a good idea of where it's going to fall when I watch it, but I am still looking forward to seeing, you know, how this vision manifested itself.
I think the good thing with this one too is even if you don't enjoy it, and for those folks that have been very vocal about not enjoying it, it always just reminds me of Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen. And when the movie came out, that was directed by Zack Snyder, I think it was like maybe 2005 or 6 or something, people were very unhappy with his interpretation. And kind of in similar vein, Alan Moore's story is 12 issues long, and there was a lot more characterization, and you lost the plot. You didn't do the things and address the weighty issues that he did. And I think Alan Moore's rebuttal to that was basically, my book is still on your shelf. So feel free to do whatever you want. Either watch the movie, don't watch the movie, read the book. Similar with Salem's Lot 2024. If you don't like it, the 1979 miniseries is just sitting there waiting for you. And if not, go read the book. Either way, there's a lot in Salem's Lot to enjoy. You know, I think they took that 79 movie and then made it in just under a 2-hour movie. Another version of it, there's maybe early aughts TBS or TNT miniseries. I think it's like 2 episodes. You mentioned Langoliers, Alan. It's in that era with like Storm of the Century, Langoliers, and, you know, TNT was like, hey, look, it's Stephen King. And it's like 2 nights, like The Stand when it was on ABC. And, you know, you got to check it out. If you like the Salem's Lot world, there's a lot of different ways to digest it. You don't have to not watch the 2024, or if you do and enjoy it, even better.
I think that's a good point by you, Brian, is the Storm of the Century thing, Pete. So if you were a fan in any way of the like terrible greatness of Storm of the Century,
give me what I want and then I'll go away.
Yes, Colin Fiore, just whiskeyed up. If you are a fan of Storm of the Century, Pete, like Langoliers for its shitty attempt to do a Stephen King, you will like this Salem's Lot. It's decent.
Speaking of whiskey, since you just mentioned it, Alan, this is the time of the program where we break into our sponsor this week, which is the Weldon Mills Distillery here in Durham, North Carolina. Actually, they are not a sponsor, but they may be soon. Yeah, we'll work on that. But since Alan, you and Bex have been to this distillery with me, where we've had our tasty cocktails, I just picked up a bottle of this sweet and high maple syrup bourbon. The best thing about Weldon Mills Distillery whiskey is not only does it taste great, it's great for you.
And let me say, Pete, that the greatest part of coming to North Carolina, outside of seeing you, was sitting in Weldon Mills with you, talking movies and television and crushing whiskey.
We should have recorded. That could have been our first Fan2Fan live broadcast. Fan2Fan After Dark.
Hey, have you seen this? Today's agenda? Environmental
playing your
goals?
6th string tonight, Torbjorn?
Yeah, but I haven't played in a long time.
Guns N' Roses.
What are we going to do about this?
I understand. I am so sorry.
Look, I mean, you can't have a conference facility without Wi-Fi.
No, but we can't.
No, you can't.
No, but we have it. I said we have Wi-Fi. It just disconnects occasionally. But Ingrid, we'll sort it out. Roy, stop. Go fix the internet.
Again?
Yes.
You're joking.
Hurry up.
Again?
Go now.
Okay.
I'll throw one out there to keep it going. The Conference. It was on Netflix. Swedish slasher horror flick. And in short, you basically have a bunch of employees going out to a conference, kind of like in the middle of nowhere, not only to get to know each other, but it seems like they have like a big benchmark that they just met with their company and they're ready to kind of move on. And the first part where you get to kind of see all the quirky characters, the ass kisser, the person who obviously does like 90% of the work and kind of keeps the place afloat. And you get to meet these people, and then they meet a person that's doing like team building activities, trust falls and rappelling, activities that some of them are all in for and other of them like could not be bothered to be a part of. And what you start realizing is they start really smartly sprinkling the fact that this company is essentially building a massive housing development. And the property that they bought from a farmer that is now going to be developed into perfect community that has the pool and the playgrounds and is meticulously kept up is essentially because this deal that was made with this farmer that all of them believe just happened to give them the land at a hell of a deal. But you find out that the farmer took his life, and that maybe what the events of this housing development and how it's coming to be maybe are not as advertised. And the employees that are interested in figuring out, like, are we paying the farmer what he's owed because of what we're building? And it really, I think, starts getting into a little bit of the questions that I think we have now about like the role of corporations and how much power they have. And you're thinking like, why are you bringing this movie up? It's like, cause that amongst all of that is a really good slasher film. And all of a sudden you get this guy who is essentially dressed up as the mascot of this housing development. And he's going around with an axe, killing people. And it starts kind of playing off as a mystery because they introduce these people and you just know like somehow one of these people is the killer. What are their motivations? What's behind it? You start getting into the fact that one of the employees is starting to uncover the fact that maybe this deal didn't materialize the way it should have, but it's got a lot of like tongue-in-cheek humor because I think they realized very quickly we basically have a mascot running around killing people. So let's lean into the fact that this is ridiculous. So there's a little bit of a black humor. So I think for that alone, it's a very self-aware Swedish horror film that seems to have its pulse on like modern day questions about corporations and buildings and rights and land and how that all works. The slasher stuff was so well done. The movie just looks so good. Great acting. Highly recommend it. And if you have Netflix, throw it into queue, especially in October. You won't be disappointed.
Interesting. I have not even heard of that before. So, yeah, thank you for kind of just bringing that one out. Allan, have you heard of this?
I have not heard of it either. I am interested for sure. I mean, I like a movie, a horror movie that is like it's a like Bernie just sort of alluded to. It's a slasher inside of like a mindfuck movie. I'm trying to recall. There's an 80s movie that does this where it's like they're filming a movie. And it's from the late 80s, and they're filming a slasher movie, and there's an actual slasher going around killing people. I'm trying to find it now.
The Mooney?
Yes.
Return to Horror High? Is that?
Yes.
Love that you just pulled that out of nowhere, Pete.
Oh, it's not out of nowhere, Bernie. Bernie, do they do, is there like that tonal shift? Like, does it start out as kind of like you're kind of watching one type of movie, and then like the slasher portion hits? Does it like do like that tonal shift, or is it more just kind of there from the start?
I think it stays consistent because you get these employees in a retreat. And I think because they did such a good job establishing who these people are, and it answers all those questions. Well, why don't they just get on a cell phone and call the police? Well, because they're at a retreat where they're trying to build confidence and trust. So they've collected all the cell phones and they don't have cell phone access. And all the events take place within a matter of a few hours. So it keeps the intensity up. It almost feels like you're watching it in real time. The reveal made sense. Some movies like this kind of don't stick the landing, or they kind of telegraph it. And you're like, yeah, it really is less about that. It really is more like the execution of the kills and the slashing. This is cool. Like I could certainly see how this could turn into like a franchise, but it seems like it's a franchise that is still trying to say something and not just trying to kill a bunch of teenagers.
Interesting. Minor point, but is it in Swedish or with English subtitles, or is it in English?
All the above. It does falter from the I think, Netflix globalization issue where they're like, hey, this is so good. How good is it? Let's bring an English cast to completely redub everything. And I think like most of movies like this, you can probably do it for a little bit, but then you start realizing that it just doesn't sound or feel right. So you just have to go to the subtitles. You just need to hear these people talk in their own language to really make it work. So if you can't deal with subtitles, they give you the option. I just know I don't know that I would recommend it.